Hello, and welcome back to the ILTV Podcast. I'm Maayan Hoffman, Executive Editor of ILTV, and we're so happy to be back with our viewers and our listeners. Now, I have with me today somebody who sits in Jerusalem and Petach Tikva both. Jerusalem, where the NGO Monitor organization is headquartered. This is Olga Deutsch, Vice President of the organization. Welcome, Olga.
Thank you so much for having me, Maayan.
So, I want to start out with something a little bit personal. So you grew up in Serbia, though you now live, as I mentioned, in Petach Tikva in central Israel. Is there anything from your Serbian upbringing that shapes how you're seeing the war today in Israel?
Well, that's an excellent question. And you and I know each other a little bit beyond the studio, so
Yes.
you know that it does.
Yes.
I think, and I will share the personal perspective of Serbia, but I think that Central Eastern Europe in general differentiates how members of the Jewish community coming from that geographical area in Europe view the war and view conflicts in general. We tend to be a little tougher, so less things scare us. But I also think that the history of the environment from which the countries from which we come allowed us to grow Jewish in a slightly less anti-Semitic environment. Let's put it that way. That is not to say that there was no anti-Semitism in Serbia, but the narrative, the national narrative in Serbia was completely different than the one in North or Western Europe. It was a narrative of partisans fighting against the fascists and against the Nazis, and they take very, very profound pride in that. And so defending Jews, or standing up for Jews was part of that. But more even if that weren't enough, Serbia has its own share of wars in the last 30 years. I basically grew up in between wars. I was rescued twice during the wars in Serbia by Israel. And evacuated here. But I think that the Serbs understand conflicts on their own skin. I think they understand bias in the media and the United Nations, because a lot of times in the history, Serbs were misrepresented. And if none of that was enough, as a country that is still lined up to join the EU, they are extremely interested in forging ties with the West. And when Brussels did not deliver enough, Serbia, like many other countries in the region, turned their attention to DC. And I think that because of the strong bond between Israel and the U.S., Serbian government, like many other Central Eastern European countries, see strong ties to Israel as a short conduit to DC. So all of this sort of shapes a very, very friendly environment towards Israel. And even if we did talk about anti-Semitism, I'll put it this way. I grew up surrounded with Judophilia as opposed to anti-Semitism. Now, it does thrive on the same types of stereotypes, but the typical anti-Semitic tropes would be, the blood libels and using Christian children for sacrifice purposes. Whereas in Serbia, I grew up surrounded with, you Jews are so well connected, we want to be like you. So it's the same type of world dominance type of trope, but it comes across differently and makes it a slightly more friendly environment.
And it's fascinating because, as you mentioned, Serbia has also been extremely pro-Israel. Now, perhaps it's, as you mentioned, because of its ties to Washington or its longing to have closer ties with Washington. Maybe it's because of the Judophilia. Is that, I get saying that right, what you called it? But talk to me a little bit about that, because the war has been 2 years long, and we've seen, one after the other countries that even were pro-Israel sort of falling off the pro-Israel train and going the other direction. But you haven't seen that happen in Serbia. Why do you think that is?
Well, first of all, I think that the people in Serbia have a lot of respect to standing up for yourself. And I think that they look up to Israel in many ways. They see a country that is even smaller than Serbia that is thriving despite, the turbulent history and environment and neighbors and lots of wars. So there's a lot of admiration to Israeli startup and army and how the country came about. And all of this plays into the very friendly environment and sort of saying we want to be like Israel. We want a trajectory where Serbia develops similar to how Israel does. But friendships are, you mentioned the last 2 years, are measured by actions and not just words. And many of our great friends, including Germany, have been very big and generous on words, but in practice, Germany very quietly froze arms export to Israel when Israel needs it the most, whereas Serbia was one of the few countries that saw an unbelievable increase. Elbit just signed a deal in August, totaling $1.6 billion with Serbian government for arms exports. Drones,
Albert to Serbia.
To Serbia. But the other way around. In the last 2 years, Serbia has delivered tens of airplanes with ammunition to Israel when other countries failed, right? Or froze or went down. So I think that Serbia was one of those that said, well, we're not just going to send a solidarity mission to Israel and say great words of praise and re-emphasize Israel's right to defend itself. We're actually going to show that we are going to help them defend themselves.
Yeah, which is really the best kind of friends across the board, from individuals to countries.
And the last 2 years have been one of those times when I was actually super proud to hold both passports, right? The Serbian and an Israeli one, and celebrate that relationship. And I think it was crowned by Prime Minister Netanyahu's meeting with President Vučić, right? The President of Serbia's meeting at the GA, the UN GA in New York a couple of weeks ago. And let's just remind ourselves that this was in the midst of the political tsunami, as it was earmarked here, where all the other European states were one by one recognizing Palestine in basically rewarding Hamas, right? Without posing any conditions on the Palestinian side.
Yeah, I mean, so it's really super amazing, because I feel like we don't talk about Serbia enough, and maybe we should be talking about that country more. Our allies are so few and far between. I was looking into some of the things that you've written lately, because, of course, you and I have known each other a long time, and I've been reading and following the work that you've done at NGO Monitor and otherwise for a while. But I started to pull up just some of the more recent op-eds and things that you wrote to kind of see what are you thinking about right now. And, I saw that very shortly, I think it was in maybe the Times of Israel, but correct me if I'm wrong, that you had written this piece after the 12-day war with Iran. And you argued the better question isn't who won, but what changed. And I think that's a very good question, because really nobody wins when there are rockets that fall on Israel and so many people die in such a short amount of time and so much destruction and money is lost. But obviously we hopefully did some severe damage. But the real question is, you're right, what's actually changed? So I guess my question for you is, because I don't think you really got into it in the pieces, what did change? And, why do we know that that's what's different?
It's such a good question, and actually one that is befitted even for this week, right? As we are looking into the deal and the hostages return home, and it begs the question, even in the context of Gaza, what comes now? What has changed, and has anything changed? I think there are no winners in any war. Yeah. We have paid an incredible price here in Israel and the global Jewish community, and that will stay with all of us forever, right? It has painted our lives, I feel, and formed, and was very formative in terms of how the Israelis and the Jews around the world view their relationship to Israel and their Judaism. But the important question is, what have we learned and what has changed on the ground? So no question that the geopolitical situation and the map of the Middle East is different now than 2 years ago. And in that sense, Israel has exuded unbelievable power and strength and creativity, right, to completely destroy Hezbollah, right, the most powerful terrorist army in the world. Only 2 years ago, we have caused Hamas very significant damage. We have won physically on all 7 fronts, and we do hope that the day after will now bring the extension to the Abraham Accords and will rewrite the Middle East, right? We see that what happened in Syria wouldn't have happened without Israel's interference, and so on. But it still begs the question, has anything changed? Not militarily. We have always been good at waging wars physically.
Tactical.
Tactical and also physical. Yes, October the 7th was a catastrophe, and there will much will be more written and examined. But once we got ourselves on our feet, the IDF, we were winning on all fronts, where we completely lost the battle, unfortunately, and we will continue to lose it, I am sorry to say, is the global political arena. Some call it, the media. Some call it the how Israel is perceived. Some call it the social media. I call it the political arena because it encompasses all of these fronts.
Okay.
And even as we now are talking about a ceasefire and a return of hostages and a deal brokered with historical things like Qatar and Turkey, who were harboring Hamas until now, were basically brought to the table and want to see a different Middle East. We don't know yet who's going to govern Gaza, just like we don't know what's going on inside of Iran, connecting it to the peace that you referred to. Will anything on the Palestinian side and Iranian side change? Or will we still continue to see lots of hatred coming out of that and radicalization? And I've written a lot since October the 7th about the need to actually completely reshape the discourse. We need to focus on physically securing the borders, but then culturally and educationally secure what is the reality in each of these places moving forward. Unless the Palestinian kids are taught to believe in, I don't use the word peace easily, but in coexistence, right? Or at least are taught not to hate the Israelis and the Jews. And unless they're, and not only for our sake, but for their own sake, so they don't re-elect Hamas or someone like Hamas, we will end up seeing the same cyclical war. And globally, look at it now. All those who were pro-Palestinian, right, and fighting genocide and the death toll and fighting for the poor Palestinians, they're nowhere to be seen now where the war is being brought to an end. Because I think there's a lack of strategic outlook on fighting radicalization, but then also educating globally, the masses.
Well, there are
We're not knowledgeable
models,
on this.
right? There are models. I mean, you look at Saudi Arabia or you look at the United Arab Emirates, which are two countries where they decided they wanted to modernize, reduce radicalization within their own society. They started, just as you said, with the textbooks. They have started to re-educate their populations. And you see these are societies that are becoming more and more, let's call it westernized, or being able to work with the West more effectively. And they're also more inclined to work with Israel. So certainly, that has come to fruition. And I think, it's interesting because you're very right. Like I was reading Trump's 20-point plan, right? And going, point 1, point 2, and like each of the different lines, they're all very vague and short. And you can start to get down to the bottom. And you see that 19 and 20 are about the Palestinian Authority being kind of revamped and, rejuvenated in another more positive way, revised. And then you have point 20, which is that we're going to live in coexistence and we're going to have either like Palestinian statehood or some kind of peaceful, entities living side by side. And it sounds so lovely. I mean, you walk through the steps, you're like, wow, if we could just get to 20, like we're only on point 1 now, but if you could get to 20.
But then one of the points revamps also UN and UNRWA and NGOs, right, that have been complicit to the radicalization and diversion of aid, but not only physically, but also they perpetuated this hatred, right, as a raison d'etre of the Palestinian people, sadly, not only Hamas. And we here in our part of the world, we know that it wasn't just Hamas. Someone elected Hamas, right? But it also, let's talk about PA for a second. Right. The PA is being reintroduced now as one of the as one of the best options.
Right.
And as if we all had a collective amnesia. What was the reality surrounding PA 2 years ago on October the 6th?
What was the reality surrounding the PA 2 weeks ago? I mean,
Exactly. And Mahmoud Abbas, when Macron praised him in, I think it was May, earlier this year, for condemning October the 7th, I'm not sure how many people actually checked what Abbas really wrote in that letter.
What did he say?
He said it is condemnable, meaning if someone condemns it, he understands that there's a reason behind it. So, I love it. Sort of, when I debate and going back to Serbia, I've interviewed in Serbia since October the 7th more than 200 times.
Wow.
It's insane also how much appetite and interest there is for this. But then they ask me, and oftentimes people will say to me, well, okay, but we expect more from Israel because Israel is a democracy and a democratic country. And I think that we need to also start dealing with and expecting from the Palestinians to be treated as grown-ups.
Yeah.
And if they want to coexist, then whether it's Trump or the rest of the international community and the Arab states that will be vested here in the day after, they need to demand that they live up to that coexistence. And it starts with re-educating and taking that hatred out of the narrative. Peace, will come afterwards in a few generations.
Yeah, it will take time, certainly. But wouldn't you say we also just have to sort of get rid of all the leadership and start over in the PA situation? I mean, it just seems like, you speak of Abbas, who's not only old and sick and really can't lead his people, but also very corrupt and not so good for his own people, let alone not so good for Israel, and this is stuff that we know for many, many years. It is interesting. I always find it fascinating when people think about helicoptering the PA into Gaza. I'm like, well, they haven't really ruled there for 18 years. 20 years now at this point, right? It's 2025, so it's been 20 years. They've had no role in Gaza. And how are you going to just bring them in and now all of a sudden say, now you take over here? There is no Palestinian governance and no entity.
And, let me use the Serbian metaphor again, because I was born in a non-democratic country, in a post-communist country, and then eventually, after the revolution in 2001, we were introduced to democracy. And much of the same, UN agencies and German and Norwegian consuls and refugee consuls and organizations came and flooded us also with lots of money, all to invest in sustainable development and democracy. And one thing that I learned is that teaching societies the rights is the easy lesson. Everyone gets that. What do I get in a democratic society? But teaching the people what are the obligations of a citizen over of a government in a democracy, that's the lesson that most never learn. And I think the international community, if they truly want anything to change moving forward, they also need to be tougher and say, okay, the PA and the Palestinian territories will be flooded with money now. There, speaking of Gaza, there will be billions, tens of billions to rebuild, renew, and reconstruct. But whether any of this will be conditioned, and if we or they, the international community, finds that there's a breach, right? What will be the sanction? In the past 30 years, since the international community started flooding the Palestinians with free money, basically, there were absolutely no checks and balances and absolutely no sanctions. And I think that is the main question that we should be focusing on now, while hopeful both for the Palestinian people themselves and for our own safety here, and one day maybe an ability to coexist.
Amen to that. Well, NGO Monitor actually focuses on stopping the funding of the terror groups, and a lot of what you just discussed, which is that checks and balances, that who's giving money to who and where is it going and how is it being used. So tell me, as you've been going through this over the last couple of years, what has been the biggest red flag that you found? What have you said, we need to make sure the world understands this, and this specific thing is what has to stop?
Well, it is basically the fact that until October the 7th, most of the Israeli government and the establishment and most of the pro-Israel ecosystem, if you'd like, was not really aware or didn't want to place enough strategic importance to the full-blown political warfare that was being waged and continues to be waged against us. And when I say us, I mean the State of Israel and the Jewish people globally, in parallel to the Palestinian physical terror. When we talk about diversion of aid, which is now a fact, right? The abundance of evidence that emerged since October the 7th only proves that what we all figured is the case. Most people think that it's physical aid. And very few know that when governments provide aid to the Palestinians, a significant portion of it goes to what they earmark as political advocacy projects. Okay. And too many of these organizations, these non-governmental groups, which we at NGO monitor, and we then circumvent the financial streams, right? And we trace them back to official aid monies. They flow to Palestinian NGO terror proxies. You have a group of Palestinian NGOs that define themselves as human rights groups, but in practice, they're affiliated to PFLP, being the most prominent politically active terror group. Okay. And, let's remind our viewers and listeners, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and PFLP are all political parties, but also designated terrorist organizations. So, but the difference is that PFLP has an NGO arm as well. And they are the ones behind literally every attempt to politically harm Israel, whether it is the ICC, whether it is the ICJ, right, cases. It was Al-Haq, Al-Mazan, and PCHR. By the way, 3 Palestinian PFLP-affiliated organizations that the U.S. Government designated a few weeks ago.
Right.
They were the ones that filed the first submission to the ICC and had a first meeting in November 2023. The apartheid and genocide libel started on October the 8th and October the 11th, respectively.
Was already
spearheaded by these
pre-planned.
organizations. The ICJ South African case, it was these 3 organizations plus the Human Rights Watch that were basically co-authors of the claim. And I can go on and on and on. Let's jumpstart to, the arms embargo deals. It was Al-Haq that filed the lawsuits against the UK and the Dutch governments, trying to basically prevent the governments from supplying Israel with U.S. F-35 aid, military aid components. You want to talk about Eurosatory, right? The biggest defense fair trade in Paris.
Right.
It was Al-Haq that spearheaded the campaign that eventually Macron government succumbed to and told Israeli delegations that they are not welcome. So there's, and I can go into details. We don't have enough time to literally pinpoint to a direct link between Palestinian NGO terror proxies, many of whom are funded through official aid monies, to this political campaign. And the political warfare was literally there to normalize the physical terror on one hand, and on the other hand, continue to erode the legitimacy of the State of Israel and all its agencies, including IDF, but also to spread, fear monger really around the world and mobilize the masses to terrorize the Jewish communities around the world. And these two go hand in hand together.
Yeah, and we've really seen that over the last 2 years. And I think some of it starting, with the good work of NGO Monitor, but also others to really start to come out of the, the closet. Yeah, for lack of a better term. I'm sure, I think you probably met with her when Lara Burns was here, who was from the former FBI agent who spent so much time researching the history of Hamas, doing the exact same thing as you just described in the United States, that the seeds were planted. They have worked slowly and steadily to infiltrate the newspapers, the media, the college campuses, et cetera, et cetera. And now, when you come out, 20 years, 30 years later, right? This was she was talking about from the 9/11 era. So you're talking about more than 20 years ago that they were, even in the 90s, that she had started to see these things. And now they're very patient. Americans, we think, like, what's in front of my face, right? Exactly. Like, what am I eating for dinner tonight? They're thinking, what am I going to do in 30 years, exactly. Right?
But the difference is, I recently spoke at the International Counter-Terror Institute's conference at the Reichman University on a panel on dealing with a lot of these issues. And I said there, the counter-terror experts around the world, they understand that terror organizations have long recognized charities and non-governmental organizations as the frailest pieces of our societies, because they're the easiest to penetrate, to abuse, and hijack, right? Whether it is to do money laundry or to whitewash narratives, radicalize groups, recruit, and so on, mobilize. But somehow, when it comes to Palestinian terror groups, the counter-terror experts have different standards. It's all of a sudden everything becomes political, and it exits the realm of we're fighting terror, right, and becomes a political discussion. And I think even going back to your original question, right, of what has changed on the ground, unless that changes, it will not really matter whether we call them Hamas or we call them something else. There will be a radical, hateful, jihadist seed that someone will abuse, right, and turn into an engine. And whether it will take it 10 or 20 or 30 years, we will find ourselves in a similar reality. And I think that this is the crucial moment. And the one thing that is different than the previous attempts is that we now have the Arab states invested in this, because this is the real novelty in this.
Yeah.
That it's not just the Western powers trying to broker a peace in the Middle East, but we have Arab states saying, okay, we want to see a different reality here. And if they embark on this seriously, I think we might at least have a chance of trying something different.
Incredible. And I mean, hopefully, as you said, it's a re-education, and maybe it's in all of those Arab states also that are, jumping on the bandwagon, Turkey, Qatar, et cetera, that certainly need some re-education in their own countries as well. Well, Olga Deutsch, we're unfortunately out of time, but I really appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure, Maayan.
Thanks.